apropos of KGO, and apropos is a ding word, I want to welcome in a guy who is, I'm going to say this, I hope he won't take offense. I feel as though he's the elder statesman of KGO with a sagacious quality to, his various takes on politics, and sagacious is a ding word as well. How about John Rothmann, everyone? Come on. Yes. You are
sagacious.
the sage.
Sagacious. Yeah. Very interesting. Good.
Yeah, you are the sage, my friend. Listen, John, before I get into some of the stuff that's happening now, Ukraine, a year in, et cetera, there is because of the Jimmy Carter thing, there is a conversation going on. It's going on in our chat. It's been going on here on the air as to his presidency. There were great achievements in his presidency. He was a victim of circumstance during his presidency. There are also those who say, no, he was great on details, but he was too into details, and so he didn't lead the nation in a way that it need be led. What was the truth about the Carter presidency in your judgment?
Well, historically, and I take a look at all the latest polls from presidential historians, and I'm included in that number, he ranks about in the middle. He's not viewed as a great president. He's not viewed as a failure. He had great successes during his presidency, including, as you pointed out earlier with Spencer, the Camp David Accords. He's the one who forged the first agreement, and there's no doubt that he deserved great credit for that. The other thing that I think he will stand out for, he's a great environmental president. He was awarded by the Sierra Club at the turn of the century, the award along with Theodore Roosevelt and Richard Nixon as being the leading environmental presidents. So that was quite something. And of course, most people don't realize it, but the Panama Canal Treaty was a great debate in this country. And it was during the Carter administration and due to Jimmy Carter that in the end, by one vote, the vote of Dennis DeConcini, who was a Democrat from Arizona, Senator DeConcini, that the Panama Canal Treaty was approved. So there were pluses and minuses. You ask about Carter's presidency overall. He was a micromanager. You couldn't use the White House tennis court unless Carter signed off on it. So he had the pluses and the minuses. He was not a successful president in terms of the overall evaluation of history. And as you pointed out, Mark, and rightly so, the Iran hostage crisis was a disaster. And Carter's handling of it, from the decision to admit the Shah to the United States for treatment to the bungled rescue effort, which I don't blame him for. Any president would have done it. Just happened that it didn't work. Carter took a lot of heat on a lot of things. By the way, one of the most interesting aspects is Tip O'Neill, who was Speaker of the House, got along splendidly with Ronald Reagan, but not with Jimmy Carter. And of course,
that is interesting. That is really interesting. He seemed to be, I was mentioning, sort of pure of heart and spirit. I don't know what that gets you in Washington because, it's not necessarily something that's rewarded. But when you say that, I think, gee, I wonder how these negotiations go down. He seems like such an earnest man,
He was earnest. There's no question about it. But it also is true that many in the Democratic Party opposed him. I would remind you that Teddy Kennedy ran against him in 1980 in the Democratic primary and carried states like New York and California overwhelmingly. So although he lost the nomination, for Carter, it was a near fatal blow. And so that is an important part of the history as well.
And before I completely move on, and I do want to get to a lot of what's happening now with John Rothmann, what about the economy, which suffered under double-digit inflation during his presidency?
Remember, that started really with Richard Nixon and wage price controls. And then Gerald Ford took the presidency, and remember, inflation was sky high remember, I love it.
Whip inflation now.
The headline of the New York Post was that Ford said, "Drop dead to New York." There were all sorts of issues, but Carter's handling of the economy was very tough. You all remember the interest rates in those days, as high as 15%. So it was not a great success for him. But I have to tell you, you can't really hold a president necessarily responsible for the ups and downs of the economy. Those are things that happen, that over which very often presidents have no control.
Now I want to ask you about what is going on today.
Yes.
Biden is president. Biden took apparently it's presumably, this case, but now as I read about it, it was even more delicately planned trip to Ukraine on this 1-year anniversary week. He took a super well laid out strategic trip he had wanted to take prior. I didn't realize that either until I done some reading about the trip that he's made. So anyway, he's in Kyiv, and he's there to address essentially the situation with a war 1 year in, and to renew, if you will, America's faith in supporting Ukraine and that they will prevail over this Russian incursion. Give me your thoughts on this situation 1 year in.
Joe Biden did a magnificent thing. He went to Ukraine. It's a city under siege. Presidents have traveled to war zones in the past, but this was a particularly important statement. Today, he's meeting with those nations which border Ukraine because he wants to reinforce the fact that Russia cannot cross that line. I thought that Biden did an outstanding job. And what was most interesting to me, because I listen, I suffer from low blood pressure. So I listened to Fox, and the attacks on the president for going to Ukraine and theoretically, in their minds, anyway, ignoring the problems here in the United States, from the train disaster in Ohio to the southern border, it's pathetic. And so I listened to Republican leadership, and the most important single thing to tell you is that Mitch McConnell has been solid in terms of his support for the Ukrainians. And I think there is a division in the Republican Party. It's not unusual. The Republican Party has always had divisions between isolationism and interventionism. And clearly, the case needs to be made and is being made to the American people that what we are doing is really the first line. Essentially, if I can paraphrase, what Zelensky has said to us is what Winston Churchill said before World War II. Give us the tools and we will finish the job. And the question is whether they'll have the tools, will they have them quick enough? And may I just add one other quick point, and that is with all the attacks on NATO, and remember that it was Donald Trump who wanted to gut NATO and withdraw from NATO at one point, that the NATO alliance has never been stronger. And the most telling line was the president yesterday saying they wanted to weaken NATO, and now we have Sweden and Finland in NATO. So I think the legacy, whether Joe Biden is reelected as president or not, his steadfast support for Ukraine, his steadfast support for NATO will be a key part of the Biden legacy.
Let me ask you then what you see the next year playing out like, because even as we can talk about the bravery and talk about our steadfastness in standing with Ukraine, we are flirting with a nuclear capable Russia that has just pulled out of, and this is the other thing I wanted your comment on, an important nuclear accord, an agreement about nuclear weaponry,
which was signed by Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev. I want you to know that what Putin is doing is very disturbing. It's not just disturbing to people in the United States. It's disturbing in Europe because there is a real fear. One of the things people don't understand is why did the president go to Poland? Because the Poles see themselves as a potential target of Russian expansionism. And we've made a firm commitment. And you will note that the president spoke again about the fact that an attack on one is an attack on all. This is a critical turning point in American history. And the withdrawal from the nuclear agreement is purely symbolic. He didn't really withdraw. He put it on hold. I mean, all kinds of nuances to it. But the simple truth is we live in a highly charged nuclear world, which frankly is very dangerous. So this is something, again, that has to be worked on and looked at carefully. I will mention the fact that Iran and North Korea are now working actively to help Russia. And Iran is on the verge of a nuclear capability. They're now at 86% enrichment, if not higher. I just heard the number 86%. And of course, North Korea has a nuclear capability. And the drones that are being used now by the Russians are coming from Iran. I mean, is this, if I can use George W. Bush's line, an axis of evil? The answer is whether it's an axis of evil or not, it is a danger to the whole world. And we need to be aware of that. Let me just point out that while Biden spoke, Russia fired its gargantuan missile for a test. And although Putin didn't talk about it, everybody was talking about it because it sent the wrong message at the wrong time, unless what Putin is trying to do is to really intimidate the United States and Joe Biden. And he may be doing that. But I think it's to his error People should not underestimate Joe Biden's resolve in this matter. Whatever you think of Biden, whether you like him, you dislike him, whether you think he's strong or weak, on this matter, he is being strong, effective, and a real leader, and has the genuine support of European leaders. I listened to former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson do an interview the other day. He's been here in the United States, and he applauded what Joe Biden is doing. And so this is something that we better understand and understand carefully. And for those conservative Republicans, it's not the mainstream of the Republican Party, it's the far right of the Republican Party. They're trying to attack the president, and Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity and Laura Ingraham and the usual chorus line of right-wing commentators. I think they make a huge, huge mistake. Their own credibility is put in jeopardy.
What is showing up in the chat now? Comments along the lines of this one. At some point, we need to determine how involved we're going to remain with Ukraine. Somebody else said, what in Ukraine is of interest to U.S. Taxpayers? I wonder if you can just speak to the importance of our involvement in Ukraine and support of Ukraine within this geopolitical system that you've just talked about, or at least touched on.
Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe. Without Ukraine, the European food situation would be a disaster. The largest nuclear plant in Europe is in Ukraine. They are a vital source of energy. They are the front line, if you will, for all of the Eastern European countries: Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic. That's why everybody is right there. And if you take a look at a map of Europe, it's very small. It's not big. Those of us who've driven Europe, and many of you have gone on trains or driven a car across Europe, or if you haven't, you need to understand it's a very small amount of space. So we have a vital interest. And I can assure you that as long as Joe Biden is president, and I believe even if Joe Biden left the presidency, we would be committed to Ukraine. We can't afford not to.
Now to this country.
I'm not a warmonger. I'm not in favor of a full-scale war. What we're basically doing now is a defensive operation, not an offensive operation. We are not involved in the front lines of this thing. And it's what we did for Britain in 1940 before we entered the war, in early 1941, where we gave them the ability to survive. Without us, Ukraine would fall. And if Ukraine fell, let me tell you, there would be a domino effect. And I don't necessarily subscribe to the domino theory in Southeast Asia, which was a myth. But this domino theory is real, and all you have to do is see what's happening. By the way, do you know in Poland, it's very interesting. I found out this yesterday. They're building, like they have in Hungary already, a memorial tribute to Ronald Reagan. Because whatever, again, we think of Ronald Reagan, he was viewed in Eastern Europe as a liberator.
Sure.
And he is honored for that reason.
And, that reminds me of the Reagan line, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. And so these presidential addresses on a world stage are important. The rhetoric of those addresses is important. And even the symbolism of those addresses can oftentimes be important. So you make a very good point there.
You're absolutely right. 100%.
I want to ask you about this story that is getting some oxygen. And it's about it's again, these far right flamethrowers like Marjorie Taylor Greene in this case, who plays the culture wars, but also really plays the very Trumpian. You never had heard it from a president before, this sort of us versus them, right versus left, red versus blue. You really never had heard at the presidential level anything but, we're all Americans and I'm a president for all Americans. That's been the familiar refrain from president to president, regardless of how policies actually shook out. I mean, Trump seemed to be driven by revenge on Democrats, and we know that, and we know how it played out here in California as well, with taxing, with various tax intricacies that were targeted toward Californians and hitting us hard. Anyway, Marjorie Taylor Greene has now suggested that there should be a national divorce, that the red states and blue states be separated. She is saying, and she's actually put some, meat on the bones, that if a Democrat moves to a red state, they actually not be allowed to vote for the first 5 years of residency.
Well,
Uh,
let me just
there's
say,
no need for the Department of Education, she says. Red states and blue states would be in control of their education in each state.
Mark, if you believe in the party of Lincoln, just go back and read Abraham Lincoln's first and second inaugural addresses. As the eve of the Civil War, he said, "We are not enemies. We must be friends." And what was Lincoln's great refrain? That he had to bind up the nation's wounds. He wanted to restore the solidarity of the Union. There is no higher goal for Democrats and Republicans, for all Americans, than the understanding of the unity of America. And I must tell you, a lot of people laugh at it, but that's why Joe Biden, in his closing lines and most of his speeches, says, "And God bless the united," and he underlines and emphasizes the word united states of America. What Marjorie Taylor Greene is doing, and what, frankly, a number of the others, Gosart and the others, what they're doing is undermining the very fabric of what the United States of America is. Look, Mark, we're not a perfect country. We aren't. We've made a lot of mistakes. There are a lot of issues which we have with policies then and now, but that's not the issue. The reason America has been success is because of its ideas, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States. These documents propelled us to become more than just a nation. We are not a great nation because of our wealth or our power. It's because of our ideas. And that has a refrain from not only liberal Democrats like Adlai Stevenson, but by Ronald Reagan, a conservative Republican. That was what unified us. And we should not lose that unity. And frankly, for those in Georgia who think Marjorie Taylor Greene is a great patriot, quite the contrary. She is somebody who clearly does not have the best interests of unity in the United States at heart.
Well, and she's saying, John, just to the point, because it's, and the reason I mentioned some of the specifics is I think they track with certain corners of that party, particularly, which are associated with get the government off my back type thing. She says, in a so-called national divorce, there would not be a civil war, but instead states would have more power to govern themselves. Like, oh, that's good. I mean, states are going to govern themselves. I get it. This system would feature Green suggesting red states temporarily stripping Americans who move from blue states of the right to vote. I mentioned that. And possibly could even implement discrimination against LGBTQ people. And this is a quote, "Well, if we have a national divorce, there's no need for the Department of Education. Red states and blue states would be in control of the education of each state. They would not allow any type of gender lies being taught in their schools. LGBTQ woke teachers would be fired and not allowed to teach there," she continued.
Mark, it's a disgrace. And
Yeah,
the Republican Party needs to, frankly, do better. And the leaders of the Republican Party, whoever they are, need to speak out against that kind of rhetoric. It is divisive, and frankly, I believe it to be un-American in every way. Remember, Marjorie Taylor Greene is the one who talked about Jewish space lasers starting forest fires here in California. This is she's a nut and a kook. And let me point out, we've had nuts and kooks in Congress over many, many centuries, and it's okay. That's part of the American dynamic. But it is up to people like the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Kevin McCarthy, who is now embracing Marjorie Taylor Greene as a firm ally, to know better. And I'm going to tell you, in 2024, in the presidential election and in the congressional races, the record of the Republican Party is going to be up for a vote. And if the last election is any indication, that's not necessarily a good thing for them.
John, so much going on. I love that you are here with us on Wednesdays to weigh in on it. I so appreciate you, and the audience, of course, loves you. So really, I'm just exploiting you when I reflect on it.
May I say I'm delighted to be exploited, and I love being with you and with Kim and Albert. Thank you, Albert, for arranging everything. So it's always a pleasure and an honor for me to be on the Mark Thompson program.
Oh, that's so great. How about it for that sexy beast, John Rothmann, everybody? Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Love seeing you, man.